Hey, everybody, and welcome to our final two chapters in Esther. Tonight, we're going to finish up Esther, see how everything wraps up, and then I'll kind of go through and recap everything that we learned in the past couple of weeks. So, this is super exciting. So, I'll open us up with a prayer. Thank you, Lord, for this time in your word. And I just pray that you would open our eyes and ears to what you have in these last two chapters of Esther to help us understand you more, and to help us be a little more like your son, Jesus, and a little less like ourselves. Amen. So let's get right on into it. Chapter 9's a little longer than the chapters we've been looking at. So I'll read through that and go through it, but then chapter 10 is really short. It's only 3 verses. Let me take a sip of water and just get started. All right, so chapter 9. Now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, the time came for the king's command and his decree to be executed. On the day that the enemy of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred, in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. The Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could withstand them, because fear of them fell upon all people. And all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces, for this man Mordecai became increasingly prominent. Thus the Jews defeated all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with slaughter and destruction, and did what they pleased with those who hated them. And in Shushan, the citadel, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. Also Parshandatha, Dalphin, Aspetha, Paratha, Adalia, Ariditha, Parmashta, Arisai, Aradai, and Behezatha. Please forgive me for the pronunciation of the sons of Haman. The 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, they killed, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. On that day, the number of those who were killed in Shushan, the citadel, was brought to the king, and the king said to Queen Esther, "The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men in Shushan, the citadel, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It shall be granted to you. Or what is your further request? It shall be done." Then Esther said, "If it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are in Shushan to do again tomorrow, according to today's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows." So the king commanded this to be done. The decree was issued in Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. And the Jews who were in Shushan gathered together again on the 14th day of the month of Adar and killed 300 men at Shushan. But they did not lay a hand on the plunder. The remainder of the Jews in the king's provinces gathered together and protected their lives, had rest from their enemies, and killed 75,000 of their enemies. But they did not lay a hand on the plunder. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar. On the 14th of the month they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews who were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day, as well as on the 14th, and on the 15th of the month they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages who dwelt in the unwalled town celebrated the 14th day of the month of Adar with gladness and feasting as a holiday, and for sending presents to one another. Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews near and far who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, to establish them among them that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar as the days on which the Jews had rest from their enemies, as the month which was turned from sorrow to joy for them, and from mourning to a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, of sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted the custom which they had begun, and Mordecai had written to them, because Haman the son of Hammedatha and the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to annihilate them, and had cast Pur, that is the lot, to consume them and destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letter that this wicked plot which Haman had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that his sons should be hanged on the gallows. So they called these days Purim after the name Pur. Therefore, because of all the words of this letter, what they had seen concerning this matter and what had happened to them, the Jews established and imposed it upon themselves and their descendants and all who would join them, that without fail they should celebrate these 2 days every year, according to the written instructions and according to the prescribed time, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, that these days of Purim should not fail to be observed among the Jews, and that the memory of them should not perish among their descendants. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim. And Mordecai sent letter about Purim, and Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus with words of peace and truth to confirm these days of Purim at their appointed time, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had prescribed for them, and as they had decreed for themselves and their descendants concerning matters of their fasting and lamenting. So the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. And because chapter 10 ends rather quickly, I will just continue on and finish up the book of Esther. Chapter 10. And King Ahasuerus imposed tribute on the land and on the islands of the sea. Now all the acts of his power and his might and the account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of Kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second to King Ahasuerus, and was great among the Jews, and well received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of his people and speaking peace to all of his countrymen. Thanks about the bangs. I did just cut bangs. Whew! Okay, that was a lot. So let's go back through it and see how this chapter ends, because I know me reading probably got to be a lot after a while. All right, so let's bring it back to the top. Now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, the time came for the king's command and his decree to be executed on the day that the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overcome them. The opposite occurred, in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. So, well, let's continue. The Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. No one could withstand them, because fear of them fell upon the people. And all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, all those doing the king's work, helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai became increasingly prominent. Thus the Jews defeated all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with slaughter, destruction, and did what they pleased with those who hated them. So the Jews definitely had their enemies, and there were people in the kingdom who sought to destroy them based on Haman's decree. Yet they had the king on their side. That's the Jews. The Jews had the king on their side with all of his resources, and with the king for them, it really didn't matter who was against them. With the power that the king had, and the resources, I want to say officers, but people like that would make up an army. He had everything. And we see that the Jews defeat all their enemies, and yet we know the Lord isn't explicitly mentioned, but we also know that his hand is in the game the entire time. We can see him doing this. He's protecting his people. Romans 8:31 states, and I put this in here, what then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? Because I said up here that, if King Ahasuerus is for them, who can really be against them? Because they don't stand a chance. But above it all, God is with them. And if God is for them, then nobody can really be against them. Verse 6. And in Shushan, the citadel, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. All the names of the 10 sons of Haman. the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, they killed, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. So there's a lot of things alluded to in this end that we're going to get into, but this is one of them. We see this line throughout this chapter a bunch, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. This incident is the antithesis, or the exact opposite, of Saul's disobedience to God. Saul failed to kill the Amalekites and took forbidden plunder that God had specifically asked him to destroy. So basically he looted and stole things for his own material gain that the Lord had asked him not to do and to actually destroy. He didn't. He stole it. The Jews took no plunder. So that's made very clear throughout this whole time when they're killing the sons of Haman. And we'll see how the sons of Haman are killed in the end. So verse 11. On that day, the number of those who were killed in Shushan, the citadel, was brought to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have been killed and destroyed 500 men in Shushan, the citadel, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It shall be granted to you, and your further request, it shall be done. Esther said, if it pleases the king, ought to be granted to the Jews who are in Shushan to do again tomorrow according to today's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. Just as their father had been, she asked the king to hang his entire bloodline. And the Jews who were in Shushan gathered together again on the 14th day of the month of Adar and killed 300 men at Shushan, but did not lay hand on the plunder. We see that again. The remainder of the Jews in the king's provinces gathered together and protected their lives, had rest from their enemies, and killed 75,000 of their enemies, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th of the month they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. So during my study of this, I found that many had criticized Esther for having Haman's sons hanged in the gallows in the same fashion that he was hanged, saying that it shows a lack of love for her enemies. Yet she displays the same principle often found in the book of Joshua, and she would not settle for less than a total victory. Haman and his sons were descendants of the ancient Amalekites. God commanded Saul, the son of Kish, to execute the full extent of God's judgment against the Amalekites, and you can go back and read that in 1 Samuel 15. Saul failed, but this later descendant of the tribe of Benjamin, the son of Kish, named Mordecai, our very famous guy in the book of Esther, completed God's judgment against the Amalekites. So on to the second half of this chapter, which is the Feast of Purim. Verse 18, but the Jews who were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day, as well as on the 14th, and on the 15th of the month they rested, made a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages who dwelt in the unwalled towns celebrated the 14th day of the month of Adar with gladness and feasting as a holiday, and for sending presents to one another. So Purim is the 14th day of Adar, which is like February to March. And by those in village, so on the 14th day of Adar in February/March, by those in villages and unwalled towns, and on the 15th day by those in fortified cities, to commemorate the deliverance of the Jews from genocide through the efforts of Esther. And they rejoice and distribute food and presents. Continuing on to kind of close out this chapter, I'll go over starting at verse 20. And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews near and far who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the days on which the Jews had rested from their enemies, as the month which was turned from sorrow to joy for them, and from mourning to a holiday, and that they should make them days of feasting and joy, and setting presents to one another and gifts to the poor. So this is kind of like reiterated throughout until about verse the end of this chapter, highlighting the importance of it. So making sure that the Jews celebrate the 14th and the 15th day in the month of Adar. So they call these days Purim after the name pure. Therefore, because all the words of this letter they had seen concerning this matter and what happened to them, the Jews established and imposed it upon themselves and their descendants and all who would join them, that without fail they should celebrate these 2 days every single year. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, were with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews to 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus with words of peace and truth to confirm these days of Purim at their appointed time as Mordecai, the Jew, and Queen Esther had prescribed for them, and they had decreed for themselves and their descendants concerning matters of their fasting and lamenting. So the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. All this to say that the principle of remembering God's great deliverance is good, and we too often forget his great works. And today, Purim is like just how it's practiced today is one of the more popular Jewish feasts with costumes, games, and noise. But I mean, going back to what I just said a second ago, all this to say, like, the greatest principle is remembering God's great deliverance and how good that is really emphasized in how God repeats this throughout this book, that this was supposed to be like a terrible time for the Jews, but now this time is spent for you to have festivities and eat food and just praise, good times for what Esther and Mordecai were able to accomplish for the Jewish people. Chapter 10. And King Ahasuerus imposed tribute on the land and on the islands of the sea. So the king imposing a tribute was actually a system of taxation and even forced labor, which would restore the depleted treasury, all the money that they had lost when he fought that costly war with Greece. If you remember all the way back to chapter 1, King Ahasuerus had fought and lost an extremely expensive war, also at the hands of people who he trusted. Verse 2. Now all the acts of his power and his might and the account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second to King Ahasuerus, and was great among the Jews, and well received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of his people, and speaking peace to all his countrymen. In the end, here we see the rise of Mordecai, a Jew, to the second highest position in a pagan court. And this is a reminder of Daniel in Babylon and of Joseph in Pharaoh's Egyptian court much earlier in Israel's history. And another example of how God's people lived victoriously even when scattered among the nations. So I'm going to give a virtual high five to all of us for completing the book of Esther over the past couple of weeks. We did it, and we will figure out which book that we're reading next. But I kind of gathered some key takeaways from the book that I want to go over. So I wanted to think about all the ways that like God had arranged situations in the story of Esther, even though we don't explicitly see like the Lord written in the book of Esther. We can see all the ways that he arranged situations. So God arranged for the noble queen Vashti to lose her place. We remember our queen Vashti being replaced by Esther. God arranged for a competition to replace Queen Vashti. God arranged for Esther to enter the competition. God arranged special favor for Esther among the other women. Remember, Esther was one of like 400 different women. God arranged for Mordecai to have access to both Esther and the affairs of the kingdom, and God arranged for the lot that was cast to give 11 months warning before the planned massacre back in chapter 3. God arranged that a decree command that the Jews be killed by private hands instead of by the army of Persia, which would have been much more difficult to stop. Excuse me. God arranged that Haman restrain his anger and not kill Mordecai immediately, back in chapter 5. God arranged for Esther to delay her request, first asking for a banquet with the king and then another. God arranged for Haman's anger to come to a peak on one particular day. God arranged for Ahasuerus to have a sleepless night. God arranged for Ahasuerus to send for a certain book during his sleepless night. If you remember that section was really good. God arranged for Ahasuerus to listen to the passage about Mordecai in that particular book. God's hand in history never rules out our actions. The actions of Esther and Mordecai were critical to the preservation of the people of God. And God's will is accomplished, and yet men are perfectly free will. They have free will. God allows that to us. Haman did as he pleased. Ahasuerus did what he wanted, and so did Mordecai and Esther. We see no interference, no coercion. They all did their will and bear full responsibility. Yet God works out his eternal plan for the ages through it all, for their good and his glory. And God, in his wise and unseen plan, allows for his people to be tested. We saw that that was a big part of Esther, sometimes severely, which we had seen. And we can't just assume that servants of God will be protected from every trial, because the trials are part of God's design. It was a great trial for Mordecai. He refused to bow to Haman, and others would soon suffer for his refusal to pay homage to Haman. And it was a great trial for Esther. She heard the news of the coming slaughter of her people and had to boldly approach the king to make an appeal, even though that could very well have costed her life. So I think those are really great themes throughout, and just to kind of go back and see God's hand at work throughout all of the book of Esther. And I think I'm going to have that written. I want to put that somewhere under here, and I'll figure out how I'm going to do that so you can go back and look at it. But yeah, this has been a really great study. This is my first time reading through the book of Esther, so I felt like I really learned a lot, and doing these in-depth studies over YouTube Live for everyone to join in with me has been great at keeping me accountable of that, and helping me learn my Bible more deeply. So I really am grateful for this platform that God has allowed to me. And yeah, I'm gonna see everybody next week, and the people in the Happy Habits group will get a look into what book that we'll be starting. But as for YouTube and YouTube Live, it'll be a surprise. So we'll see that surprise next week. I hope everybody has a great week, and my cat says good night as well.